This video is brought to you by Incogni. For the last few decades, Western commentators have been anxiously worrying about China's meteoric rise and the prospect of a Chinese challenge to the US-led global order. However, as China's economy has slowed and the world has become increasingly wary of its economic dependence on Chinese manufacturing, the tone in Washington has changed, and some analysts are even claiming that we're now past peak China, in other words, that China is in decline, and therefore that America's standing as the world hegemon is safe once again. So in this video, we'll take a look at China's power on the world stage in terms of economics and geopolitics, and consider whether it has actually peaked.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos.
So when people talk about peak China, they're usually referring to the fact that China's economy looks like it might finally be plateauing, at least relative to the US. Between 1980 and 2022, China's GDP per capita relative to the US went up exponentially, from 2% to 28%, fueled by rapid growth in industrial production and manufacturing exports. According to IMF data for 2024, China has the second largest world economy after the US in terms of nominal GDP, and actually overtook the US in purchasing power terms back in 2016. Unsurprisingly, this sparked some anxiety in Washington, but in the last few years, China's economy has been beset by a series of crises which have dampened GDP growth. We've done a whole load of videos on the various crises afflicting China's economy, so definitely check those out if you'd like to know more. But in a nutshell, China's economy has always relied too heavily on exports, which were super competitive because the CCP essentially suppresses Chinese wages via indirect mechanisms like an undervalued currency. But China's various economic crises are all related to its overdependence on exports. Low wages mean Chinese households take on unsustainably large mortgages, which is why the CCP got so worried about the property sector in 2021. Chinese manufacturers rely entirely on foreign exports because they don't have a domestic market. And there's more deflation, because Chinese households just can't spend enough to keep prices high. Anyway, as a consequence of these crises, China has experienced an economic slowdown over the last few years, marked by stagnating GDP growth, declining foreign investment, and a stock market collapse. While China's statistics agency still claims that GDP growth is strong, coming in at 5.2% in 2023, these numbers should be taken with a pinch of salt, not least because regional governments in China have a habit of overstating their numbers. And the CCP's increasingly frantic interventions in the economy are a tacit admission that China's economy is in trouble. Anyway, this has provided some respite in Washington, with lots of American analysts now claiming that the US has seen off peak China, and confidently predicting that America's status as the unipolar world hegemon will continue. So, is this true? Have we really seen peak China? Well, economically, it's hard to imagine China enjoying the same level of rapid growth we saw over the last few decades. Despite the CCP's best efforts, China's economic stagnation has continued, and weak domestic demand, manifest as deflation and low international demand for exports, mean it's unlikely to recover anytime soon. Another issue often cited by American analysts is China's aging population and low fertility rate. China's fertility rate has dropped to an estimated 1.09 births per woman, and the proportion of working-age people is slowly declining. The IMF predicts China's elderly population to increase dramatically over the next few decades, with the over 65 cohort more than doubling by 2049 and the number of over 85s tripling. You get the idea. China's economy is clearly slowing, and its nominal GDP looks unlikely to catch up to that of America anytime soon. So, does this mean that China has peaked? Well, that depends on what you mean by peaked. But one thing to say is that just because China seems to have peaked economically, that doesn't mean it's peaked geopolitically. For starters, while America has a larger GDP in dollar terms, China has a far bigger industrial base. A good proxy for this is aggregate electricity use, where China actually overtook the US way back in 2010. That's not to say that America's non-industrial economic sectors are geopolitically irrelevant, but it is plausible that economic activity like heavy industry is more geopolitically significant than, say, management consultancy. Similarly, China's overseas investments, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative, give it outsized influence in its neighbouring countries. According to the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index for 2023, China's regional economic influence in Asia and the Pacific is greater than the US's, in large part thanks to pacts like the 2009 China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement and the 2020 RCEP, the world's biggest free trade deal. And while most analysts still consider the US to be the world's strongest military power by quite some distance, China's military strength in the Asia-Pacific is increasing, while at the same time, the US is having to devote most of its attention to Ukraine and the Middle East. Similarly, China's diplomatic standing has improved since it toned down the wolf warrior diplomacy, which has helped Beijing pick off Taiwan's remaining allies, including most recently the island state of Nauru. At the same time, America's global reputation, at least within the UN, is being undermined by its staunch support of Israel and the prospect of a second Trump presidency. But perhaps the most underappreciated element of China's geopolitical power is the fact that it dominates the supply chains for basically all green technology. If you want to build a wind turbine, a solar panel, or an electric vehicle, chances are some or most of it will come from China. This is good news for Beijing because historically, energy dominance has been a pretty good proxy for geopolitical power, in much the same way that America's emergence as the world hegemon in the early 20th century, for instance, was in large part down to the fact it was the world's largest oil exporter. Similarly, China is in a sense the world's largest exporter of green energy, or at least green technology, and history suggests this will improve its geopolitical clout. All in all, the jury's still out on whether or not we've seen peak China. While China's economy is clearly struggling, growth is still relatively strong by international standards, and in many respects, China's geopolitical clout and its ability to challenge the US is still increasing. Clearly, the current state of this world is being plagued by uncertainty and risk, and whilst you've been watching this video about China, your personal information may have been sold or published online without you even knowing it. Even whilst recording videos, we're interrupted by robocalls, and if you're wondering why you also may be getting random numbers calling your phone, well, the answer is the malevolent working of shady forces, called data brokers. These data brokers can collect and sell your personal information to anyone, from a company to an online criminal. This data can include your name and aliases, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and much more. But even if you're not fussed about a call here and there, one day it could be a little call, but the next day a huge loan could be taken out under your name. So if you want to protect your data, Incogni is here to help. Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal, and deals with any objections from their side. Since many data brokers continue collecting your personal information even after they've removed it, Incogni also takes care that your data stays off the market by conducting repeated removal requests. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.